Get started. So I'm delighted to have Donald Robertson here. He is the author of 6 different books, including How to Think Like a Roman Emperor. He is a practitioner of cognitive behavioral therapy, and has written numerous books on Stoicism. So let me hand it over to Don. Don,
Hi, can everyone hear me okay?
perfect.
Great. Well, thanks very
Can
much.
hear
First of
okay?
all, it's a pleasure to be here. And usually, I like to start off just by kind of saying a little bit about how I got interested in Stoicism, if people are interested in that. Then we'll talk about the PDF, Stoic Therapy Toolkit, we call it, and hopefully give people some practical concepts and techniques that they can actually use. So really my interest in Stoicism began I studied philosophy at university. My background's in academic philosophy originally, and then I trained as a psychotherapist. And as a young guy, I was interested in Buddhism and self-help, philosophy and Freud and stuff like that, all these kind of things. I suppose I was looking for a direction in life or something like that. And after I'd finished 4 years of philosophy at Aberdeen, I still struggling to find something that really worked for me, that ticked all of these boxes. I was into Buddhism, I was studying existentialism, I was training. I went back to reading the works of a French scholar called Pierre Hadot, who writes about philosophy as a way of life. And it struck me that Hadot was saying that of all the ancient schools of philosophy, the one that had the most practical, the most psychological techniques in was Stoicism. And here's an irony for you, a paradox, if you like, that most undergraduate philosophy degrees don't cover the Stoics. They're one of the few major schools of philosophy. And the reason for that, if you ask academic philosophers, is that they believe the Stoics mainly inherit concepts and arguments from Socrates and Xenophon and Plato and other early Greek philosophers, and that all the Stoics did was to develop the practical psychological implications of those ideas as a way of life. So it's not worth studying them, really. Now, the irony is that's precisely the reason most people today are particularly interested in the Stoics, because they take these abstract concepts, develop the practical implications of them. And that's really what drew me to the Stoics. So they were the last school of philosophy, in a sense, that I looked at. And immediately I felt as if in Stoicism, I'd found a philosophy of life. I'd found something that was linked to modern psychotherapy, which I was training to do. I was training as a counselor and therapist. And I found something that contained a lot of spiritual exercises or self-help or psychological techniques. I was very interested at that time in every psychological technique. I was very interested in self-hypnosis, very interested in Buddhist meditation and yogic meditation. Suddenly, it was like all these different things I was studying just suddenly came into one big thing. They kind of coalesced into a single subject. Even at the time, I like to kind of joke about it and say that, I had this tremendous feeling of relief because I suddenly realized I only really needed to read one lot of books now. I had this huge library of books, and I thought, now I just need to read the Stoics because they tick all of these books for me. That was about 25 years ago, and I still feel the same way. I trained in lots of different types of psychotherapy, and I quickly settled on my main approach being cognitive behavioural therapy. And for those of you who don't know, I know a lot of people might be aware of this, but some might not. The connection between Stoicism, CBT, CBT, cognitive behavioural therapy, is the leading modern evidence-based form of psychotherapy. The connection is very explicit. The pioneer of CBT, Albert Ellis, I understand Walter Mitwaychuk is going to speak to you about. He's going to talk to you about rational emotive behaviour therapy in a few weeks or whatever. And Ellis, the founder of rational emotive behaviour therapy, the main precursor or the first form of CBT, depending on how you look at it, back in the 1950s, he, like a lot of people at the time, had been doing psychoanalytic therapy, and he got fed up with it. He decided that it didn't really make sense. He felt it was pseudoscientific and it wasn't working for him. So at that point in the 50s, a lot of people were becoming disillusioned with the psychoanalytic approach, and Alice was one of them. He did something that I've always admired people for doing. He decided, rather than kind of shuffling around the deck chairs in the Titanic, he was going to scrap the whole thing and start again completely from scratch and build an entirely new approach to psychotherapy from the ground up in the middle of his career. He decided, I'm going to start again from scratch. And one of the main things that he drew on was he cast his mind back to when he was a teenager. He'd read Marcus Aurelius and Epictetus, two of the main Stoics. And one idea in particular really resonated with him. It's passage number 5, the handbook or Enchiridion Epictetus. And it has in it a quote that's probably the single most famous quotation of Stoics. It says, it's not events that upset us, but our opinions about them. And Ellis made that quote even more famous because he taught it to all clients, as far as I understand. And he uses that quote in most of the books, many books that he wrote about cognitive therapy or REBT. And subsequent generations of cognitive therapists all became familiar with that Stoic quote. The reason it resonated so deeply with them is that it encapsulates something that we call the cognitive theory of emotion, which is the fundamental theoretical premise of all cognitive therapy. It's the idea that our emotions are determined largely, if not exclusively, by... I'll give you an illustration of that. When clients come to therapy, they'll sit down in the consulting room and something kind of cliched or stereotypical usually happens in the first session. And to put it kind of simply, the client will talk about all their problems, their anger, fear, sadness, and then they'll talk a lot about how this is causing suffering. They'll say, look, it's damaging my relationships, it's interfering with my quality of life, it's preventing me from doing my job properly. And then they'll talk about their symptoms and the consequences to it for their quality of life. Then the client will listen to themselves saying this stuff. At some point, very often, in therapy, will reach a point where they'll turn to the therapist and they'll say something that's very intriguing. They'll say, I know my anger, fear, sadness, or whatever is causing me all these problems. It's a big problem in itself. I can't help it, they'll say, just the way I feel. And that's an interesting thing to say because it kind of draws a line that says, change this, there's nothing I can do about it. It's a huge problem, it does this and it does that, and affecting my relationships. I've been struggling with it for years, and they've built it up, and the conclusion is, I can't do anything about it. Boom. And they drop it on the therapist's table. There you go, it's your problem now, they're saying. And Ellis used to lean forward to his clients and say, yes, but it's not just the way you feel, is it? It's also the way you think. Because the cognitive theory of emotion, which Ellis called his ABC model, incidentally, says that our feelings and our thoughts are not two separate. That is embedded in our language and culture. Reason and emotions are separate things is one of the big mistakes we make in life, according to the Stoics, according to cognitive therapy as well. So the Stoics said, look, reason and emotion are two sides of the same coin. They're intertwined. When you have an emotional reaction to that, someone runs up behind me and goes, boo, and I jump, I'll have what's called the startle reflex. My heart rate will shoot up and I'll feel anxious, but it's not cognitively mediated, really. I'm not really kind of interpreting the event, I'm just reacting instinctively to it. That's the exception that proves the rule. Most emotions are heavily cognitively mediated. So when people are worrying and they feel very anxious, they're usually thinking that something catastrophic is going to happen imminently, they won't be able to cope with it. They have a bunch of cliched, stereotypical, underlying beliefs that help to shape their emotional reaction. And once we identify those, it helps to heighten our awareness self-awareness generally leads to self-control in many subtle ways, but also opens up an entire armamentarium, an entire toolbox of cognitive therapy techniques. So now we can say to the clients, well, hang on a minute, is it actually true that something catastrophic is going to happen imminently and you won't be able to cope with it? Are you thinking about things in an overly catastrophic manner? Are you underestimating your ability to cope? Are you look at it happening or the severity of it? How would someone else, faced with the same situation, possibly view it differently? Or the pros and cons of looking at it that way? And what are the pros and cons of looking at it the way that you currently do? What would be the short-term and long-term consequences of continuing to think about it the way you do versus changing an alternative, more rational or more constructive way of viewing the same situation? So boom, a whole toolbox of therapy techniques suddenly explodes in our face. You know, and this is of seismic importance in therapy. In fact, we call it the cognitive revolution in psychotherapy, and it was, ladies and gentlemen, a revolutionary thing back in the 50s and 60s. It took a time to take hold. It was really Aaron T. Beck who followed in the wake of Albert Ellis's initial pioneering work, that he really got scientific credibility for cognitive therapy. Now it's the leading evidence-based form of modern psychotherapy. Huge volumes of scientific evidence supporting the efficacy of CBT. Although nothing's perfect, obviously there are exceptions to that and limitations to it and so on. But nevertheless, it is very robustly established in terms. So the Stoics, 2,500 years ago, 2,300 years ago, knew, and actually they inherited this idea from Socrates, our emotions are determined by underlying beliefs. And the Stoics knew that once you recognize that, it suddenly opens up this whole range of techniques. Now, some people said to me when we first started working on this subject, my colleagues and I, they said, you guys are all just psychotherapists, rejecting psychotherapy into ancient philosophy. And my reaction to that, and I don't mean any disrespect to them by saying this, but it's my honest view, that showed an absolutely shocking level of ignorance of the nature of classical philosophy, because the medical metaphor or model was dominant in ancient philosophy, right way back to the pre-Socratics. It was extremely familiar to all ancient philosophers to think of philosophy as a form of psychological therapy. We call it a medicine for the mind, a talking medicine. Socrates says that the elenchus, the Socratic method, is a cure, a remedy for a type of conceit, is how he describes it, a kind of intellectual arrogance that he's offering a cure or remedy for. The Stoics are important because they therapy uses philosophy, and out of all the different schools of ancient philosophy, it was the Stoics that placed the most emphasis on that aspect of things, on the therapeutic aspect. So, for instance, Chrysippus, the third head of the Stoic school, wrote a book called On Therapeutics, and they actually referred to what they were doing as a therapy of the psyche, a psychotherapy, they call it. Virtually, they call it psychotherapy, as well as using many medical models. For example, Peterson said the philosopher's school is a doctor's clinic. They're very blunt about this, and it's a major recurring theme of their philosophy, but they call it a therapy. The Meditations of Marcus Aurelius, at the beginning of the book, talking about his main Stoic mentor, Aeneas Rusticus, who taught Marcus Stoicism. And he says he thanks the gods that Rusticus spotted that Marcus's character required correction, therapia, or therapy. So he says Rusticus provided him with this kind of Stoic psychological therapy. Now, unfortunately, all the books written on that subject have been destroyed. We don't have any of them anymore. The closest we have a bunch of fragmentary references to in all the major surviving texts, and Seneca, Epictetus, Marcus Aurelius, and also in the writings of Plutarch and Cicero, who weren't Stoics but were influenced by the Stoics. And we do have Galen's books, in particular on the diagnosis and cure of the soul's passions. Galen was polymath, or less favourably, you might call him a in the nettle. He was a very arrogant man. But Galen was a doctor who studied philosophy. He was a very well-read man. He wasn't a Stoic. He was critical of some aspects of the Stoics. But he wrote his own book on philosophical therapy, which does survive today. And in it, he quotes Chrysippus and Zeno, the founders of Stoicism, and he talks about Chrysippus' book on therapeutics. So you do know something about the writings of Stoic psychological therapy from Galen, Marcus Aurelius' physician. So I became very interested in the relationship between Stoicism and psychotherapy. And another little bit to the story, I guess, is that one day I got asking me to, I used to mainly lecture psychotherapists. It was about I always thought psychotherapists would get into Stoicism, or that never really happened, actually. It really surprised me. But what I wasn't expecting was that the general public were going to become interested in it, because when I first became interested in the subject, it was a really nerdy, obscure thing. There weren't hardly any popular books on it, and people thought I was kind of crazy, like writing about this subject and lecturing about it. It was like a weird little hobby or hobby. And then one day I got contacted by Christopher Gill, who's the Professor Emeritus of Ancient Thought at Exeter University in England. Said, you want to come down from London, where I was at the time, to Exeter, and we're going to have a workshop with a bunch of about a dozen people. There's a video of it online that you can watch. I think it was 2012. And we brainstormed a project called Stoic Week. So his students had been doing, his classical studies students had been doing this thing called Live Like Galen for a week. So they'd got people to follow Galen's general health advice about sleep and diet and exercise for a week to see if it worked as a kind of holistic health approach. And they'd found they'd listened to it. It's a very clear example of a very profound Stoic cognitive exercise. So Patrick Usher, one of the students, got in touch with me and said, could we team up and something? We think our next should be not Live Like Galen for a week, but Live Like Marcus Aurelius for a week, and this recording would be perfect. So we've been doing Stoic Week every year for 8 years or whatever it is now, and I think last year we had 8,000 people. Like over the years, rough estimate, I'd say about 20,000 people around the world participated in Stoic Week. The press were all over it. We were in every major British newspaper and magazines and newspapers all over the world. It grew and grew. And we formed a multidisciplinary team of volunteers. It's a non-profit organisation, philanthropic organisation called Modern Stoicism that we formed. And we started with Stoic Week. We started gathering research data on it. And we had psychologists involved. And over the years, we've gathered a lot of data showing that Stoicism itself has certain psychological benefits. It's still early days. You won't see a lot of that data. We publish it in reports online, which anyone can read, but we don't really push it out that much because it's still pilot studies. But it's actually very, very positive results that we've been obtaining from tens of thousands of participants have done those courses. We developed a bigger course that's more controlled, Stoic Mindfulness and Resilience Training. I design that, I run it. That's starting to run in a couple of weeks' time again, actually. We normally do it about once a year. I think we've got about 5,000 people doing it this year. It's free. People do it all around the world. That's very much a skills training course. Last time we did it, we did a long-term follow-up study. So the shortest long-term follow-up, if that doesn't sound like an oxymoron, is usually 3 months. And then later you might do a 6-month, and then maybe a 12-month follow-up. We wanted to find out if the effects of Stoicism were to use the term that I like, I hear psychologists saying this, we want to find out if Stoicism was sticky. That means that often when you train people in psychological skills, they get a benefit from it. It's not sticky. They stop doing the techniques, and then 6 months later, they're kind of back to school. For example, it's a big problem. You can teach people effective techniques for problem solving and assertiveness and communication and listening skills and relationships, and it works. But then a year later, they've kind of forgotten to do it, and they've just reverted back to their old habits often. We wanted to find out Stoicism stickier than that. And our initial follow-up study at 3 months was very, very positive. We found little reduction in the effect. 3 months later, people still seem to be exhibiting the same benefits. Stoicism they've learned, and that is very exciting. Whereas excited as a bunch of Stoics can possibly be about that, because CBT is a bunch of techniques and strategies, right? And the one thing that cognitive therapists can't do is kind of indoctrinate their clients into a philosophy or a set of moral values. It has to be value neutral. So CBT has to take techniques and teach them to clients. And it's usually, with some exceptions, it's usually diagnosis driven and time limited and outcome focused. But ironically, the holy grail of psychotherapy research is prevention is better than cure. Of course, as for all health research. And research on stress prevention, we also call emotional resilience building, has been going on for a decade or more. It's still kind of in its infancy. Again, we found this problem that CBT-based training protocols, like the Penn Resilience Program, for example, work pretty well, but they seem to have to be repeated every year or two, or the effects kind of start to drop off. People forget the skills. So what we're really interested in is whether Stoicism's greatest weakness might also be its greatest strength. The fact that Stoicism isn't just a bunch of techniques, the fact it's also a worldview and a set of values, means that it's never be as useful in a consulting room setting, though it might kind of inform things in an indirect way. Where it might become very interesting is when Stoicism is trained preemptively, tentatively, emotional resilience building, because then the fact that it's deeper, more philosophical, that its philosophy is a whole way of life, then might mean that it becomes stickier. People identify with it, and it might have lasting, maybe even permanent benefits for people training in it. So psychologists are very, very interested in that. So having said all of that, I think it might be cool if we look at some of the techniques that are in the PDF, the Stoic Therapy Toolkit. So if you don't have that already, I'm sure you can get a link from the Discord server or whatever, and you can download it. And the main thing I'd say about it is it's as concise as we could possibly make it. So we've produced loads of materials in Stoicism over the years, and this is a little bit like what we do in Stoic Week. And so also that protocol has been tested loads of times. Like, we know that people like it, that it's passed the feasibility test, as it were. Yep.
John, let me interrupt you for a second. I have reposted the Stoic Therapy Kit in
Awesome.
the Saturday Stoicism channel, so you can go ahead and download it over there. Second thing, just logistically, I want to let everyone know we'll be coming to question and answer session soon, so you can line up for asking questions by typing in your questions in the Saturday Stoicism channel. All right, over to you, Don. Sorry about the interruption.
Thanks. Okay, so let's talk practice. So this toolkit, 5 or 6 pages or whatever, and also wanted it to look appealing because I knew that people would use it more then. And so we got our graphic designer. We have a graphic designer on our team called Rocío de Torres, who lives in Spain, and she designed this for us to make it look nice, as well as being kind of concise and a distillation of a lot of the stuff that we do in the Stoic to Stoicism. I don't know if some of you may be able to see it. You don't have to read along with me though. But at the beginning, the first thing it does is very briefly explain that the central doctrine of Stoicism is the idea that virtue is the only true good. Now, I would translate that differently from most people. The Greek word arete is usually translated as virtue, but I think that kind of sucks, if you'll forgive my language, as a translation. Scholars usually say they think excellence of character would be a better translation. I think moral wisdom is the best translation. So the goal of Stoicism very much is intellectual. We've said that it's a cognitive theory of emotion. It's a cognitive goal in Stoicism. Like, it's this kind of moral wisdom or insight that the Stoics are aiming for. And following on from Socrates, they believe that that's really the essence of all the virtues, which they divide into 4 categories, the famous 4 cardinal virtues of wisdom, justice, fortitude, and temperance. And that's really just moral wisdom applied to different areas of life. So justice is just moral wisdom being applied in our relationships with other people. And courage is just moral wisdom applied to fear. And temperance is just moral wisdom applied to our desires. As the Stoics would say, in order to exercise wisdom in daily life, you need to exhibit justice, or dikaiosune, social virtue, in your relationships with others. And act with social virtue, with dikaiosune, you have to be able to master your fears and desires. And those are where the other 2 virtues come in. So the Stoics want us to realize, following a bunch of arguments forwarded by Socrates, that external things are what they call morally indifferent, but they're not necessary. They don't have intrinsic value. They're not necessary to the goal of life. I'm going to have to kind of elaborate on that a bit, but I'll try and do it very concisely. Socrates, in a dialogue called the Euthydemus, followed several arguments to substantiate this. He asks Euthydemus to define good fortune, and Socrates usually begins with a banal question. His interlocutor says, well, good fortune is being good looking and wealthy and having lots of friends and having a kind of powerful status in society and a big house and stuff like that. And he thinks he's just rattling off. And Socrates typically does that, and then he'll throw a real curveball at people. So he says to Euthydemus, well, hang on a minute. Surely, let's just take one of those at a time. Wealth is advantageous if it's used by someone who's wise and virtuous. But if you give a load of money to somebody who's a vicious tyrant or a serial killer or something like that, then it's a bad thing, because it just allows them to do more foolish and evil things. So wealth in itself isn't intrinsically good. Like, it depends on the use that you make of it. And then Socrates goes through a whole dialogue where he pushes that point and argues that this applies goods that Euthydemus had named. And the Stoics assimilate this and build a whole worldview around it. So they refer to external goods as merely being advantages or opportunities. They're only of a kind of relative or subordinate value. And therefore, the most important thing in life is knowing how to use them well. It's having moral wisdom or insight. It's knowing the true value of things. And that's something that resides within us. And so the main corollary of that is a type of emotional resilience. Because if you see the most important thing in life as something that resides within you, and external things like wealth, health, reputation, the use you make of them, then, losing those things isn't as catastrophic or as threatening as most people tend to assume. So from this moral doctrine stems a kind of emotional or psychological resilience. So that's why it's so important to communicate. Stoicism isn't just a bunch of techniques. It's a moral philosophy that's the key to the emotional resilience that the Stoics exhibit. Nevertheless, there are a bunch of techniques, and I'm going to talk about 4 of them. Now, just as a precursor to that, the first book I wrote on Stoicism, which is now in its 2nd revised edition, it's called I was interested in the subject. And those were all my notes about how, from an academic point of view, what the relationship was between CBT and Stoicism. And I never thought anyone would be interested in that book. It was aimed at psychotherapists, and none of them read it. But it was published by an academic publishing house, and they were surprised. It became a kind of self-help readership that embraced it, strangely, because it wasn't intended for that audience. And now it's in its 2nd edition. Even though it found the wrong audience somehow. But that book wasn't listed all of the psychological exercises or techniques that I could identify in the Stoic literature, drawing heavily on the work of Pierre Hadot. And I found 18. And those are just the general strategies. Like, each one of those 18 could take the form of different specific techniques or tactics. So even if you talk in broad strokes, there are at least 18 distinct psychological practices in Stoicism. There are a lot. But I'm only going to talk about 4 of them. So one of them is the Premeditation Malorum, or the premeditation of misfortune, bad stuff, or adversity. Now, the irony about that is that for the Stoics, no external things are actually intrinsically bad. And so, really, when we do this exercise, what we're doing could be more accurately described as the premeditation or the mental rehearsal of indifferent things. The Stoics are rehearsing these things in order to realize that they're not intrinsically catastrophic, to realize that they're indifferent, and what matters is the way that we deal with them. So says that every day you should rehearse in your mind all of the common catastrophes that might befall us in life, or misfortunes. And that would be exile, death, poverty, sickness, all that good stuff. And, obviously sickness and death would be very relevant to the time of pandemic. But when Seneca and the other Stoics talk about mentally rehearsing exile as a punishment, pretty similar to quarantine and self-isolation in some respects. Seneca was set into exile for a number of years, and the challenges were analogous to the challenges of self-isolation during a pandemic. So the Stoics want us to prepare well in advance. Like, anyone who's trained in Stoicism should already be coping well with the pandemic, because it's something that they would have previously imagined happening many times. So in premeditation, we picture the bad thing happening right now, as if it's already happening to us. And this was one of the first things that caught my attention, because it's very similar to actually a bunch of different techniques that we use in modern CBT. There are many different forms of what we technically refer to, what researchers call imaginal exposure techniques. And I would say there are maybe at least half a dozen different psychological processes that go on when we do these exercises. So unfortunately, it's a little bit of a complex subject. But the bottom line is, we know one of the most robust findings in the entire field of psychotherapy research is that when people expose themselves to situations that provoke anxiety in a controlled manner, repeatedly, and for a prolonged period, and that's the key factor, then anxiety usually abates naturally. And the Stoics also found that when they did this, that it would naturally lead to them reappraising the situation and decatastrophizing it, as we say today, seeing things in a more rational and down-to-earth way. It allows emotional processing to take place naturally, and it also allows us to think things through and rehearse a philosophical attitude towards adversity. And so the odd thing is, people ask me, how would Stoicism help people to cope with the pandemic? And the answer is, Stoicism would already have prepared you for the pandemic, although there are things that you can still do in the middle of it. And the paradox within the paradox is that during the pandemic, the Stoics would say, rationally speaking, this pandemic for 99% of people isn't really that catastrophic. I hate to break it, something else. It is a terrible thing. It's going to kill hundreds of thousands of people. But nevertheless, it's unlikely to be the thing that actually kills you. What it does give you is an opportunity to mentally rehearse other things that you are still coming down the pipe. Eventually you definitely are going to die one day, although it probably isn't going to be from this pandemic in most cases. So it's an opportunity to build your emotional resilience right now in preparation for other things that you have to face in the future, is one way that I would look at relationships, financial bankruptcy or poverty, sickness, and even mentally rehearsing your own mortality, this existential question. The Stoics, Socrates called it melite thanatou, the rehearsal of our own death. He said it was integral to all practice of philosophy. And so the Stoics would have us do that. Just as an aside, I'm just going to talk briefly about these techniques, because I'll answer questions about them as well. But I have a caveat that I have to attach to this, which is that all psychotherapists would know that not advisable for people with certain types of mental health problem, right? So if someone has panic disorder, which is fairly common, it's probably not a good idea for them in an unsupervised and uncontrolled manner to mentally rehearse things that would provoke panic attacks, right? It may be a very good idea for them to do it in a systematic and controlled manner under the supervision of a therapist. And equally, for somebody who's depressed and suicidal, it's probably not a good idea for them to mentally rehearse their own death. So there are exceptions to this, but for the majority of people who don't suffer from a completely overwhelming, then it's an effective technique. But the crucial variable is how long you do it for. And the most common mistake that people make is there's a very powerful natural drive for people to break off the exercise prematurely. And the risk in doing that is that in some cases you can actually increase your sensitivity to the thing that you're rehearsing. So it can backfire if you don't do it long enough. And so I can't emphasize enough that it requires patience to do this exercise properly. Now, actually, that kind of segued into this whole idea of the contemplation of death in Stoicism. So the Stoics also want us to come to terms with the fact of our own mortality, which is something that I think a lot of people are really thinking about during the pandemic. I mean, again, even if it does only kill a small percentage of people, it forces us to face up to the fact of our own mortality. The Stoics thought it was crazy that we all know we're going to die one day. We could get hit by a bus tomorrow, and yet we walk about like people, as Marcus Aurelius puts it, who are daydreaming or half asleep, as if we're in ignorance of this basic fact about human life. So we don't really take advantage of our lives. Marcus said, you keep acting as if you're going to live for 3,000 years or your life is going to go on forever, but it's not. Like, you need to do the things that you really value, prioritize things properly right now. You need to seize the day. You could get hit by a bus tomorrow. So Stoics want us to dwell more in the here and now and to prioritize our true, authentic values in life. And contemplating our own mortality and the uncertainty of the future is one way of motivating us, they think, to do that. But again, as a therapist, I have to attach the caveat that for some people, that might not be an appropriate technique, although I think it's fine for the majority of people. Another very powerful Stoic technique is one that Pierre Hadot called the view from above. And I'd say there are two simple ways of describing this. On the one hand, if you've seen Clash of the Titans or Jason and the Argonauts, these old movies about the Greek gods, there's a bit where Zeus and the other gods atop Mount Olympus are looking down at humanity as if they're little chess pieces on a board. And so on the one hand, the Stoics talk about looking down on the world from high above, like Zeus looking down from Olympus, and broadening our spatial and temporal perspective. But also, this technique is linked to the study of cosmology in ancient philosophy. So trying to envisage the whole of space and time in a kind of cosmological or quasi-metaphysical way. And so this is a part of the study of philosophy, is to do cosmology and metaphysics. The Stoics were pantheists. They believed that the totality of nature in itself is something sacred. And so they're always trying to get in touch with the sense of the whole. And they were way ahead of their time in many respects. But one is that there's a large body of modern psychological research shows that when people are stressed or experiencing, and they tend to narrow their focus of attention as if they're putting stressful or depressing or upsetting events under a magnifying glass. And that's a form of selective awareness. They're ignoring other things in their environment. So when someone is anxious, we call that focus on the most upsetting, the most scary things in their environment, and they ignore what we call safety cues in the environment. So they produce a very biased interpretation of events, threat bias. And the Stoics realized this. And so they said the wise man or woman is always doing the opposite. They're always looking at things within the broader context. Because to be selective in our thinking is to commit a lie of omission. We're lying to ourselves in a way when we focus too much on individual details and lose our perspective on the bigger picture. And well as spatially, but maybe I can go into that later. And so finally, I'll wrap up by mentioning the last of those four major techniques, and that we call contemplation of the sage. So the first chapter of Marcus Aurelius' Meditations is different stylistically from the rest of the book. He talks about 17 different people. They're all tutors or family members of his. And it might seem odd to you that he lists their virtues. the things that he most admires about them in great detail. And he does it in so much detail with regard to his adoptive father, the Emperor Antoninus Pius, in the book as well regarding Antoninus Pius. I would stick my neck out and say, having studied Marcus Aurelius's life and to death, I'm just confident from my feeling of reading that there is no way that that's the first time he's done that. It has all the hallmarks of something that's very, very well rehearsed. He goes into an exceptional amount of detail. And again, we see that he's doing it multiple times, even in that book. So I think this is something that Marcus did on a regular basis. His father had been dead for over a decade by the time that Marcus incidentally. So this is a well-rehearsed exercise. Marcus has a very clear idea, a crystal clear idea of the qualities he most admires in his adoptive father, and he studies them and tries to emulate them. So this kind of role modeling is very important. Epictetus, the Stoic teacher, tells his students, when you're not sure what to do in a situation, literally ask yourself, what would Socrates do? Or what would Zeno, the founder of Stoicism, do? Or we could say, what would Marcus Aurelius or Epictetus do today from our perspective? And this is what we call cognitive behavioural modelling. There's a ton of research on this way of approaching things as well. So I think in the pandemic, the way I would explain it in very, very down-to-earth terms is like this. Can you think of people who cope badly with the pandemic, first of all, is usually the best place to begin. Do some people cope better than others with the pandemic, with self-isolation, with the threat of infection and so on? And what's the difference between the people that cope badly? What could you learn from the people who cope well with the pandemic, and how could you exemplify that more fully in your own life? And then this all leads into the whole idea of Stoicism having a daily regime and a collective learning cycle, so that we identify the qualities we want to possess and we systematically try to exemplify them. We train ourselves, shaping and sculpting our character by reflecting carefully on what the ideal qualities or the virtues are that we would like to exemplify in life. And so, ladies and gentlemen, I think that pretty much to the subject and my summary of the main concepts and practices of Stoicism. So without further ado, if it's okay, I'd like to throw it open to some questions.
Excellent. So we've got 3 people already lined up for questions. So I'm going to call upon each of you one by one. So it's going to be first AL Dream, then Swirly T, then Scott. And when I call upon you, just go ahead and unmute your mic and you can ask the question. Please go ahead. There is going to be time. There's time for more questions. So go ahead and type your questions in. Mitch is going to be after that. And keep those questions coming, and I'm going to line it. I have a line of people asking the questions, so one by one we'll go ahead and ask the questions. When you're asking the questions, just unmute your mic, ask the question, and mute yourself again. No follow-ups, because I want to get to as many people as possible. So AL Dream, if you could go ahead and unmute yourself and ask your question, please.
Hi, thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes, go ahead.
Okay, great. Thank you, Donald. Hi, thanks for the presentation and all the great. I'm wondering about whether CBT can be taken out of the clinical context and turned more into kind of philosophy of life. So you've already answered that, I think, in part. What I'm wondering specifically about is the question of motivation. So, looking to disciplines like life coaching, for example, this question of motivation is is a big one there. And I'm wondering what CBT and cognitivism can say on that question, especially thinking about, the indifference towards external things. So there is this perception that, CBT may be good for dealing with clinical situations or certain problems, certain particular issues, but as a kind of larger philosophy of where motivation becomes very important, it lags behind. So I'm wondering what your thoughts would be on that. Thank you.
Okay, cool. That's a good question. So, I mean, first of all, like you said, we've already touched on this a little bit. You CBT that are fundamental and then build a philosophy of life around them. I wonder if you would end up with something that resembles Stoicism anyway. I just pose that as a question. Because over the years, it's something that people have often asked me and that I've often reflected on. You'd probably end up with something that kind of not dissimilar to Stoicism. And many clients who go through CBT therapy, if they really benefit from it, will often think, why would I only apply this to my panic attacks? Surely the revelation that my anxiety is shaped by my underlying beliefs and all of the techniques of life. So why would I only apply this to my symptoms, my diagnosis? And then if I did apply it to everything, then wouldn't it turn into a kind of Western yoga? Like it would be like a religion or a philosophy of life or something. To come to the question of motivation, I think you're right. There are variations of CBT that place more emphasis on motivation. Again, as another aside, I would say, as I used to run a training school for psychotherapists, and gosh, I could talk about this all day, but in brief, one of the main outcome of psychotherapy is client motivation. Yet every therapist will say, yeah, I know that. Of course, that's what the research says. And if you say, so what do you do about it? Usually they say, I don't know. Right. So often they barely even assess it, right? There are also motivation building strategies that they could be using. So it is very much a neglected aspect of therapy, although there are certainly others that place much focus on it. But we're talking about Stoicism mainly, and the Stoics address motivation in a bunch of ways. So again, I probably don't even have enough time to describe them all. Traditionally, the Stoics by reflecting on the negative consequences of emotional distress, for example, or a lack of self-control. The Stoics thought that we have to do that by training ourselves to think about the longer-term consequences, in part, of being driven by irrational passions. And so they thought that by doing that, and this actually is a technique that modern psychologists doing as well, that we would be able to amplify our motivation. Another source of motivation comes from the contemplation of the sage that I mentioned a moment ago. So people today barely think there's an effort to do that. People are very lazy about it. The Stoics think if you make the effort to really reflect on the qualities you most admire in other people, not only is it quite heartening, but it's also something that contributes for your own motivation to change. So this is another way that we could use it. And Socrates also famously argued that the main motive for change was highlighting people's awareness of contradictions in their own thinking, the elenchus. And the Stoics believe that as well. They think that when people often contradict themselves. Being a hypocrite and realizing that their contradictions are exposed. And so, that often gives people a boost in motivation when you really make them aware that they're acting in a way that's in conflict with their own beliefs, or that they're two contradictory sets of beliefs. But we're really just scratching the surface here, right? There are a whole bunch of ways that Stoicism potentially contribute to enhancing motivation.
Thank you. The next question is from Swirly T.
Swirly, what an awesome name.
Hi, thank you. Anyway, my real name is Shirley. And Don, thank you so much for this presentation. So my question is pretty straightforward. I was wondering how often or how long you recommend practicing the 4 Stoic meditations, and maybe give us a more personal perspective. I'd like to know how maybe you're incorporating the meditations in your own daily routine, and if there's like a daily or weekly routine you would recommend for everyone here.
Yes. How long should they do them for the Stoics? They're like, no, this is like Stoicism isn't just for Christmas, it's for we're in this for the long haul. Like this is a permanent thing. Short answer to that. Actually, a daily routine is a central component of Stoic Week. I didn't say very much about it. I just touched on it lightly. But in that PDF that you have, it begins by describing this daily routine. And there's a framework that provides the main part of the daily routine, and then there are individual contemplative practices that are slotted into that. And long story short, training research anyway. Okay, so personal level, how do I use Stoicism? I mean, I don't often talk about my own life, but I have used Stoicism a lot, and it's benefited me a lot in life. And I talk about Stoicism with my friends and to my 9-year-old daughter. I love talking to her about Socrates and the Stoics, just getting her opinions about, like she often argues with me about the stuff that they say. I think is good, it's healthy, but she takes things away from it as well. So I would normally, one of the reasons I got drawn to Stoicism was because as a therapist, I thought it was hypocritical of me to sit and work with clients and teach them skills that I wasn't using myself. I didn't feel that I had a framework for using them because I had some problems that I dealt with. After a while, I thought I don't really have that many things that I really need to be working on using a diagnosis-driven model at the moment. What I need is a CBT-like philosophy of life. So I partly was looking for something like that so that I could actually embody the skills that I was teaching clients and didn't feel like a big hypocrite and telling them this stuff that I wasn't actually using myself. Well, I really believe the therapist should go there first. Like therapists should be using. So over the years, I've continued using CBT-based techniques and Stoicism-based techniques. Normally in the morning, I'll mentally rehearse what's going to happen through the day ahead. I'll visualize my own mortality. I'll visualize the deaths of my loved ones, like something I've been doing for many years. I have a cold shower every morning. People find this a bit shocking, but I do a lot of intermittent fasting. For the past couple of months, I've only eaten every second day. So I only eat on alternate days, and to practice, self-awareness, self-discipline. I try and practice mindfulness, and every evening I try and review what happened during the day and ask myself, what did I do badly, what did I do well, and what could I do differently next time? So there's the 3 questions that the Stoics inherited from the golden verses of Pythagoras, and again, those are mentioned, I think, in the PDF and certainly mentioned in Stoic Week. There are many. I use the view from above a lot, and I would say the main technique of Stoicism, actually, which I didn't talk about that much, is cognitive distancing, and I use a lot of verbal diffusion and cognitive distancing techniques that come from CBT but are linked to Stoicism in my daily practice. Again, I'm just scratching the surface here. I use Stoicism myself every day in a lot of different ways. So hopefully, that helps. But I think coming to terms with your own mortality and trying to identify your core values and make time for those are an important component as well, and that's something that I try to do each day.